Hello, my name is Justin, and I am going to be reading Chapter 11 of Fat of the Land, Romance of Pemmican. So let's get started. Writers who discuss Pemmican in terms of romance are usually thinking of the period which followed the struggle between the two great fur companies. In the publicity sense, that is correct. What keeps the writers from talking of romance before the day of the Nor'westers is no doubt the fact that pemmican was not then highly regarded by whites, though their tendency to look down upon anything that is the usual food of savages. The immigrant was likely to consider American foods as of lower grade than European, just because they were native. Indeed, it seems usually to have required a famine or other bit of tough luck to get the colonists to go beyond tasting and sneering at the special dishes of native America. It was no doubt the semi-starvation around colonial Massachusetts Bay and other parts of New England during the first few years which broke down there the sales resistance of an immigrant people who must have been through tradition at least as conservative as the Scottish servants of the Hudson Bay Company. Hunger taught the Puritans and rest of the New Englanders to eat succotash, corn on the cob, maple syrup, and roast turkey. We relish these now because we inherited the taste of them from our colonial ancestors. There seems to have been no pemmican east of the Alleghenies in the period when our national food tastes were being formed. It has been shown that first it was the competitive necessity of the Nor'westers to find travel rations more portable and more preservable than those of the Hudson Bay Company that swung for them into line as pemmican users. And then it was the financial success of the Nor'westers that compelled the Hudson Bay Company to follow suit. True, an occasional Hudson Bay Company traveler used pemmican even before there were any Nor'westers, especially those who joined Indian bands and tagged along with them, but they were the exception. However, it may be for the early period there certainty was romance in the story of pemmican after 1800. Now it was attracting long-distance attention from the nobility and gentry of Britain, whose most typical and reliable investment was shares in the Hudson Bay Company, and who realized that the extent of the territories from which they could draw revenue in North America and the size of the payloads of their trading expeditions depended upon the lightness and goodness of this travel ration. It was in the same period that the poet, the essayist, the historians, the speech makers in Parliament began to develop those uses for the word given in my quotation from the Oxford Dictionary, where pemmican became a figure that symbolized strength in small compass, where they very pemmican of thought was a phrase to signify the very pith of language. The romance of diamonds is perhaps more readily apparent to us from a distance than to the calves and poor whites who seek them through it pit and tunnel on the African rand, and so it may have been with the local Indians and Canadians who paddled and pulled the boats upstream in the service of the fur trade and who carried them and their cargoes with the backbreaking toil over portages that varied from a few yards to scores of miles. No one could hold a job in these labor battalions on the Portuguese unless he could carry at least a piece, meaning 90 pounds of payload, a distance of 15 to 20 miles a day, in addition to his food, bedding, and such other gear as he thought he needed. A sample of long portage was the Arctic mountain crossing from McPherson on the Peel directly west to the Bell, when the Rat River shortage was not used. The routine was that one left McPherson in time for a 3-hour carry before supper. Then he carried his loads for 4 whole days, and arrived at the Bell about the middle of the forenoon of the 6th day, and making about 80 miles in 4 days and a half. I carried over the portage myself in 1907, and that is why I take it as a specimen case. As we plodded ahead, with our burdens, we had the choice of stepping directly into the mud cracks between the hammocks of vegetation. When we sank halfway to the knee, or attempting to place a foot upon the middle of each hammock, in which we succeeded about 3 times out of 4. The 4th time we would slip, with such a discomforting result that we were likely to conclude it was simpler not to be so choosy. The tendency was to pick footing the first few hours of each day and to stop being selective when you got tired. I said the portage in September when the mosquitoes were gone. During the height of the fur trade, they usually did it in June, with heat and flies at their worst. Imagine, when the worst of possible Arctic summer days, with a steaming temperature of about 90 degrees in the shade and at least 20 degrees hotter than that in the sun, with the mosquitoes in such swarms that they would fill a man's nostrils and interfere seriously with his breathing. If he did not wear a head net that interfered with his breathing also, though to a less extent, the entire body would have to be densely clad so as to prevent insect bites. Buckskin gloves were worn and leggings. At a minimum, a man carried 1.5 pounds of pemmican, a pound a day of pemmican for the 6 days, in addition to his 90-pound payload, and then, as said, would come any gear that he thought he needed. When I carried over the Peel Bell portage, John Firth was still in charge of McPherson. He had been there since Lapierre's house and Rampart were active ports on the Bell, decades before. Firth said that in the good old days, there were very few of the portages who carried only a single piece. More than half of them carried 2 pieces, and 3 or 4 of the best men would carry 3 pieces each, meaning 270 pounds of payload in addition to their food and personal belongings. It is easy to see the importance of a condensed ration like pemmican in business of this sort. It is not so easy to see romance from the point of view of the working man, but the romance was patent from beyond the Atlantic, where the dividends were rolling in upon the British stockholders. In judging the romance of the fur trade from the angle of the working man, it must be remembered that journeys were chiefly made in summer, or as Mackenzie puts it, during the open season, when the rivers were free from ice. That was the warmest time of the year. The belief is common that the summers as well as the winters are cooler the farther north one goes. So we had better refresh our memories on how cool July was in the Pemmican country. When it comes to actual danger from heat prostration, it is not the average temperature for the year that matters, or even the average for the hottest month. Rather, it is the temperatures of the hottest days and their excess above normal. The factor of chief importance apparently being unusually high temperatures persisting for several days at a time. The length of the daily sunshine period matters a great deal also. In the tropics, where the nights is always practically as long as the day, the earth has time to cool off during a long spell of darkness. This cooling period gets shorter as the summer nights get shorter with increased northening. So that on the mentioned Peel Bell portage, or at Fort Yukon on the Yukon River, there is no complete cessation of heat delivery by the sun, even at midnight. This moves the hottest period of the day later and later into the afternoon until within the Arctic Circle, it is likely to be somewhere between 5 and 7 p.m. Consider, for instance, how the summer was in 1847 when Alexander Hunter Murray came over from Fort McPherson, about 60 miles north of the Arctic Circle, to establish the Hudson Bay Company post at Fort Yukon, which is about 6 miles north of the Circle. According to Murray's Journal of the Yukon, published at Ottawa 1910, he found it cool at the very crest of the Peck-Bell Divide, although calm and oppressively hot below. When he reached the location on which he was about to build Fort Yukon, he said, for June 25th, "We put ashore at the entrance to a small lake at 9:30 for the purpose of encamping, but the mosquitoes seemed determined we should not. I have been in the swamps of Lake Pontchartrain, and Belize along the Red River, Texas, and most parts of Gilnipper country. He never experienced anything like this. We could neither speak nor breathe without our mouths being filled with them. Close your eyes, and you had fast between the eyelids. Half a dozen fires were lit all around, but of no avail. Summarizing the experience of the first month he spent at Fort Yukon, Murray says, July was oppressively warm. I never before spent a summer so far north and could scarcely have credited others had I been told that on the banks of the Yukon, not far from the Arctic Circle, the thermometer was at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of July 10th, 90 degrees above zero. According to this, Murray was really having a cool summer for the United States Weather Bureau under the ordinary conditions of its scientific observation stations has recorded at Fort Yukon 100 degrees in the shade. There is almost necessarily a high humidity toward the country is one steaming swamp. The traveler is necessarily in heavy clothing, for he must keep out the mosquitoes, and his breathing is interfered with by a net over his face, for otherwise the mosquitoes would be filling his nostrils as they did. Murray's take all this together with midnight sun, which means a complete absence of the restful coolness of a dark night, and you have one more angel on the romantic life of the pemmican eater. Although length of the sunshine day and extreme humidity are conducive to heat prostration, there are not many accounts of this from the fur trade, and that has a bearing on the merits of pemmican, at least to those who believe that what one eats and how much he eats will condition him to the effect of heat. An enlightening case of heat prostration in the North striking because of the man to whom it happened is that of Buffalo Jones, as told through apparently verbatim diary quotation by Colonel Henry Inman in his Buffalo Jones 40 Years of Adventure, Topeka, Kansas, 1899. Charles Jess Jones was born in Illinois, where the summers are warm at times. He spent a good many of his years in northern Mexico and in the southwest of the United States, where temperatures run pretty high in the midsummer. He had traveled in equatorial Africa and in many other places. On his way towards a search for musk oxen in the Canadian Arctic, Buffalo Jones found himself on July 25, 1897, rowing alone in a boat on the Athabasca River just south of Athabasca Lake, about as far north as the south tip of Greenland. He had been rowing hard to keep off a sandbar and had cleared the bar and had ceased rowing. Inman quotes him, in another hour was floating down the river northward again. At this juncture, I lost all consciousness, and when reason returned, I found my boat lodged near the north end of a long island. I had overexerted myself, and the result was slight sunstroke. Realizing in some way what had happened, I managed to get a hold of a towel and with it applied water to my head. I recovered sufficiently to enable me to think, although my brain was in a measure paralyzed. So far as I have been able to learn from a biography of 469 pages, this was the only heat stroke that Buffalo Jones suffered in his whole career. The experience came to him in the subarctic, just about where, in the old days, buffalo pemmican was replaced by the fur brigades with caribou pemmican. It does not appear that Jones was using this food, for by 1897, the time was long past when it could be purchased from Hudson's Bay Company traders or from the Indians, unless perhaps if you gave them a year's notice. It is not necessary to go north beyond the Arctic Circle, or even north as far as the lower Athabasca, to be in danger from heat prostration. True, the risk increases with the length of the sunshiny period of each day and with the increased humidity, both of which factors are larger the farther north one goes. It is also true that there is still greater heat in the more southerly reaches of the Pemmican country. Some maintain that the true Pemmican region does not run further south than Kansas, believing that in Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri it was jerky they ate, with tallow on the side or pounded meat dipped into melted grease. Take it then that the Pemmican users did their long journeys in the temperatures that prevailed from Kansas north. Consulting the Department of Agricultural Yearbook for 1942, Climate and Allen and Heathrow dealing only with extreme records. I find that it can be as hot as 121 degrees in the shade in Kansas, 118 in Nebraska, 120 degrees in South Dakota, 122 in North Dakota, with no greater drop when on crossing north into Canada, where the top records are 112 for Manitoba, 113 for Saskatchewan, and 115 for Alberta. These records are not attained, of course, more than once in a lifetime. Still, they mean that ordinary summers can be pretty warm in the Pemmican lands. Keeping in mind the dictum of Mackenzie that pemmican is used during the summer, it is the evident how little historical foundation there is for the belief that the Indian invented pemmican as a cold weather ration and that the white man borrowed it from him with midwinter particularly in view. Truth, there was the winter use of pemmican, but that was seldom for journeys, and it was to tide over a famine period when usually the pemmican eaters stayed in camp, avoiding exertion as much as possible and sitting around the fire to keep warm. In spite of heat, mosquitoes, and grueling labor, there was romance in the work of the fur brigades, or at least it seemed so to the European servants of the company who traveled with the brigades, as we shall now see. One of the classics of the fur trade at Hudson's Bay, which has the subtle title Everyday Life in the Wilds of North America, during 6 years resident in the territories of the Honorable Hudson's Bay Company, by Robert M. Ballantyne. I use the second edition, Edinburgh. In September 1841, Ballantyne was practically fresh from the old country when he left York Factory on Hudson Bay for the Red River. The Portage La Louche Brigade usually numbers 6 or 7 boats, adapted for inland traveling where the navigation is obstructed by rapids, waterfalls, and cataracts, to surmount which boats and cargo are carried overland by the crews. These carrying places are called portages, and between York Factory and Red River there are upwards of 36 of various lengths. Besides these, there are innumerable rapids up with the boats have to be pushed inch by inch, with poles for miles together, so that we had to look forward to a long and tedious voyage. He says, however, of his companions, these hardy Canadians and half-breeds are accustomed to such voyages from the age of 15 or 16, and think no more of them than other men do of ordinary work. That Ballantyne saw romance in the journey we read in his description of the second day out from the seaport of York Factory. Upon the occasion of our first breakfast in the woods, we were fortunate. The sun shone brightly on the surrounding trees and bushes. The fires blazed and crackled, pots boiled, and cooks worked busily on a green spot at the side of a small bay or creek in which the boats quietly floated, scarce rippling the surface of the limpid water. The whole scene was indescribably romantic and picturesque. On the shores of Hudson Bay, pemmican was much more expensive than European food. Things like flour could be unloaded cheaply from British ships right on the dock at York Factory. But pemmican had to be brought by canoe and portage hundreds of miles from Winnipeg, and as things went then, was costly, even at the point of origin. Accordingly, the cheaper European foods were used, especially during the first part of the westward journey, to supplement the various forms of dried meat. Ballantyne says, for the trip being described, that the provisions of the men consisted of pemmican and dour. Farther on he describes the work of the pemmican eaters. The men used to row for a space of time, denominated a pipe, so called from the circumstances of their taking a smoke at the end of it. Each spell lasted for nearly 2 hours, during which time they rowed without intermission. The smoke usually occupied 5 or 10 minutes, after which they pulled again for 2 hours more, and so on. While traveling in boats, it is only allowable to put ashore for breakfast. So about noon we had a cold dinner in the boat, and with appetites sharpened by exposure to the fresh air, we enjoyed it pretty well. In a couple of days we branched off into Steel River and began its ascent. The current here was more rapid than in Hakes River, so rapid indeed that our oars being useless, we were obliged to send the men ashore with the tracking line. Tracking, as it is called, is dreadfully harassing work. Half of the crew go ashore and drag the boat slowly along, while the other half go to sleep. After an hour's walk, the others then take their turn, and so on, alternately during the whole day. This journey was at an ideal time of the year. The mosquitoes were gone, the days were no longer very hot, and the nights were pleasantly cool. The following year, Valentine made the same journey by canoe. During the mosquito season, he says, I did not take a tent with me, our craft requiring to be as light as possible, but I rolled up a mosquito net in my blanket, that being a light affair of gauze, capable of compression into very small compass. Such were our equipments, and on the 23rd of June we started for the interior. As they left the cool sea coast behind, the climate changed rapidly. They were 20 or 30 miles inland. The day which had hitherto been agreeable now became oppressively sultry. Not a breath of wind ruffled the water, and as the sun shone down with intense heat from perfectly cloudless sky, it became almost insufferable. The night over, breakfast consisted solely of pemmican, and our boiled into the sort of thick soup dignified by the name robiobu. As might be expected, it is not a very delicate dish, but it is nevertheless exceedingly nutritious, and those who have lived long in the country, particularly the Canadians, are very fond of it. I think, however, that another of their dishes composed of the same materials but fried instead of boiled is much more superior to it. They call it raihu. It is uncommonly rich, and very little would suffice for an ordinary man. In the account of this canoe journey, Valentine has a good deal to say about mosquitoes. For instance, at the close of one of the ordinary 15-hour working days, they stopped for the night. We soon had our encampment prepared and the fire blazing, but hundreds of mosquitoes were, as usual, awaiting our arrival, and we found it utterly impossible to sup, so fiercely did they attack us. So we at last went to leeward of the fire and devoured it hastily in the smoke, preferring to risk being suffocated or smoke dried to being eaten up alive. It was certainly amusing to see us rush into the thick smoke, bolt a few mouthfuls of pemmican, and then rush out again for fresh air, our hands swinging like the sails of a windmill round our heads. In the manner we continued rushing out of and into the smoke till supper was finished and then prepared for sleep. This time, however, I was determined not to be tormented, so I cut 4 stakes, drove them into the ground, and over them threw my gauze mosquito net, previously making a small fire with wet grass on it to raise the smoke and prevent intruders from entering while I was in the act of putting it on. Then cautiously raising one end, I bolted in after the most approved harlequin style, leaving my discomplated tormentors wondering. Such was the romance of canoe transportation when Pemmican was king. The commercial role of Pemmican has been described of necessity by most historians of frontier development in the plains section of North America, and by every historian of the fur trade. Rather than attempt to summarize them all or to average their opinions, I quote from a single writer extracts sufficiently to cover the ground fairly well. One of the most extensive users of pemmican among businessmen famous enough to leave a marked impression on history was Sir George Simpson, who for a long generation, about a century ago, was practically emperor of half of North America. In his writings, as published by the Chaplain Society and others, there are innumerable references to pemmican, but without any good description, for one does not ordinarily tell much about things that are commonplace. And to the wilderness traveler of his day, pemmican was what bread is to us, taken for granted and seldom mentioned unless bad or unless one ran out of it. I cannot find then a pertinent quotation from Sir George himself, but Frederick Merck, professor of American history at Harvard and editor of Simpson's Journal, published in 1931 as Fur Trade and Empire, says on pages 346-347 of that work. Pemmican was almost ideal voyaging provision. It occupied little space in a canoe, for it is one of the most concentrated of foods, a fact that commends it still to Arctic explorers. It was convenient to pack into canoes or to carry over portages by reason of its bag form. When properly protected from wet and mold, it can be kept indefinitely. It can be eaten, cooked, or uncooked, which recommended it particularly for long canoe voyages where haste was necessary. For all those reasons, it was an item of major importance in fur trade economy. Pemmican made possible the development of the interior communication system of the Northwest Company, and it was on this foundation also that Simpson built the remarkable transportation system of the Hudson Bay Company. The remark of Professor Merck that pemmican occupied little space in a canoe is occasional for a digression on the canoe and York boat, frightening which, with its river portages, was the characteristic thing about fur trade transportation. Many rivers had rocky rapids, in which canoes and other boats would sink, not only when there was a mishap running them going downstream, but also less frequently when tracking upstream. Then was it of importance to have goods and provisions that would not spoil in a dipping, that could be rescued either afloat in the river or sunk to its bottom. Oatmeal and coarse flour are bad from the point of view, for water penetrates throughout a bag, and watertight barrels are difficult as backloads for men to carry across the portages. Fine wheat flour is good, for when a bag of it lies submerged in a river a week, or a year for that matter, only about half an inch all around, the outside spoils. This forms a dough layer through which there is no further penetration of water. Pemmican was still better, for the water did not penetrate at all. Even chunks that had no rawhide cover were impenetrable to water and would dry in a few minutes when rescued from the stream. In this relation, jerky was not so good, for water would penetrate gradually, and drying was then a problem. Pounded meat was a bad idea, as bad as oatmeal, for being in shreds and powder. It got wet through immediately and was nearly impossible to dry. The Yankees, who contributed to the swelling fortunes of the Northwest Company during the last quarter of the 18th century, such as Pond and the two Alexander Henrys, make frequent references to pemmican in journals of the period of 1775 to 1800, but usually as taking it for granted, assuming that everyone knows its characteristics, so they need not be described. The first Yankee I have discovered who gives a forthright characterization is Harmon. Daniel Williams Harmon, 1778 to 1845, was born at Bennington, Vermont in 1800. He joined the Northwest Company in August of the year he was near the mouth of the Winnipeg River on his first journey to and through the Pemmican country. I quote from a journal of voyagers and travelers in the interior of North America, using the New York 1922 edition, pages 22 through 23. Sunday, the 3rd of August. This is the first day which I have ever spent since my infancy without eating either bread or biscuit. As a substitute for bread, we now make use of what the natives call pemmican, which consists of lean meat dried and pounded fine, and then mixed with the melted fat. Pemmican is a very palatable, nourishing, and healthy food, and on it our voyagers subsist while traveling in this country. By the time of Harmon and Inreed before the Northwest Company, when once in the land of difficult transportation west of the Great Lakes, was depending mainly on the buffalo as food, they lived nearly or quite exclusively on meat when traveling, chiefly on meat when at the posts. These provisions were secured by purchase, through Indian hunters who worked for the whites or through the prowess of the white men themselves. A few of them were good hunters. The Harmon narrative, like the rest, brings out the fact that in a stationary summer camp or at a post in winter, the diet was fresh meat when available. The hoarded foods in sequence were jerky, pounded meat, pemmican, except at feast. Pemmican was not eaten in camp if other foods were available. It was treasured for use on the road. On the trail, the food sequence was the same. Fresh meat was eaten first because it was heavy and would not keep. Then came jerky, pounded meat, pemmican. Thus far, the geographic background of discussion has been mainly the western plains of the United States and the southern Canada. Now turn to the use of pemmican in the Arctic. In the south, and indeed by fur trade usage as far north as the delta of the Mackenzie River, hard by the polar sea, pemmican had been a summer food because most journeys depended largely on canoes that required ice-free rivers. In the extreme north, the sledge took the place of the canoe, and journeys were largely in winter when the rivers are ice boulevards and the sea frozen and walkable, which eventually made pemmican there a winter food. However, the first exploration of northwestern Arctic Canada was done by canoe and boat in summer. The considerable use of pemmican for summer travel and Arctic exploration started in the third decade of the 19th century. The Hudson Bay Company played a large part in the overland exploration of the Arctic between 1820 and 1860. The company had been using pemmican before 1800, but not, as I have said, in the systemic way of the Nor'westers, nor much on winter journeys. In 1819, Hudson Bay Company officers in London believed that their representatives in Canada would be able to supply the expedition which, as the Dictionary of National Biography has it, the British government was sending out with the general idea of amending the very defective geography of the northern part of America. Sir John Franklin was to be the leader with Sir John Richardson as medical officer and chief scientific observer. But when the party reached Cumberland House in 1820, they found again, quoting the dictionary, that owing to the rivalry amounting almost to war between the two trading companies which disputed the territory, no supplies were available. This scarcity of pemmican is usually considered one of the reasons for the great hardships of that expedition the following year, when some of the party died of hunger and some killed others to eat them. If this part of the romance of pemmican, it has a gruesome slant. When Franklin's second expedition came along, 1825 to 1828, the Pemmican War was over and supplies were again available. With pemmican as the chief ration, the Franklin now descended the Mackenzie, so its mouth and himself surveyed the Arctic coast westward as far as Beachy Point, just east of the Colville, while Richardson, in a remarkably successful and easy journey, mapped the coast eastward from the Mackenzie to the copper mine, ascending the river and crossing to Bear Lake. This whole journey was made in spring, summer, and autumn. Between 1836 and 1840, supplied with pemmican by the Hudson Bay Company, Thomas Simpson went down the Mackenzie and west along the Arctic coast beyond Sir John's farthest, to complete the mapping of the north coast of Alaska by attaining Point Barrow. Later, pemmican took his eastward, and that he particularly completed the delineation of the Arctic coast of the mainland, discovering the long-sought Northwest Passage. There were also summer expeditions. Pemmican was now upon occasion made in England. It was the recognized food of explorers, and this was the beginning of the great age of polar discovery. Those who became familiar with pemmican in the north used it on other journeys, and for a variety of purposes, sportsmen began to take it up. With the possible exception of Sir Edwin Sabin in the field of mathematics and physics, the greatest scientist who was engaged in northern exploration for the British government during the first half of the 19th century was Sir John Richardson, Doctor of Medicine from Edinburgh. Friend of Burns and teacher of Huxley, he accompanied Franklin on his first and second expeditions, as I have mentioned, and led one of the search parties when Franklin, with 2 ships and 128 men, had disappeared on the third venture led by him. Alone or in collaboration with other distinguished scientists, Richardson wrote a series of works on botany, zoology, and related subjects. He continued to the narratives of the Franklin expeditions and published the story of his own journeys. It is then possible to epitomize both the use of pemmican in the exploration of the time and the opinion generally held of it around the middle of the 19th century through quoting from the Arctic Searching Expedition, Volume 1, pages 36 through 40. Incidentally, this is the best description I have found of pemmican making in Britain, as distinguished from the Indian practice described heretofore. In April 1847, I had the advantage, said Richardson, of a personal interview with Sir George Simpson, Governor-in-Chief of Rupert's Land, who was then on a visit to England. He informed me that the stock of provisions at the various posts in the Hudson Bay territories was unusually low through the failure of the bison hunts on the Saskatchewan, and that it would be necessary to carry out pemmican from this country, adequate only to the ulterior purpose of the voyage in the Arctic Sea, but also to the support of the party during the interior navigation in 1847 and 1848. I therefore obtained authority from the Admiralty to manufacture forthwith the request quantity of the kind of food in Clarence Yard, and as I shall have frequent occasion to allude to it in the subsequent narrative, it may be well to describe in this place the mode of its preparation. The round or buttock of beef of the best quality, having been cut into thin steaks, from which the fat and membranous parts were pared away, was dried in a malt kiln over an oak fire until its moisture was entirely dissipated, and the fibre of the meat became friable. It was then ground in a malt mill, when it resembled finely grated meat, being next mixed with nearly an equal weight of melted beef suet or lard. The preparation of plain pemmican was complete, but to render it more agreeable to the unaccustomed palate, a portion of the best Zante currants was added to part of it. The best was sweetened with sugar. Both of these kinds were much approved of in the sequel by the consumers, but more especially that to which the sugar had been added. After the ingredients were well incorporated by stirring, they were transferred to tin canisters capable of containing 85 pounds each, and having been firmly rammed down and allowed to contract further by cooling, the air was completely expelled and excluded by filling the canister to the brim with melted lard, through a small hole left in the end, which was then covered with a piece of tin and soldered up. Finally, the canister was painted and lettered according to its contents. The total quantity of pemmican thus was about 17,427 pounds at a cost of about 7 1/4 a pound. But the expense was somewhat greater than it would otherwise have been from the inexperience of the laborers who required to be trained, and from the necessity of buying meat in the London market, and at a rate above the contract price occasioned by the bullocks slaughtered by the contractor for the naval force at Portsmouth, being inadequate to the supplying of the required number of rounds. As the meat in drying loses more than 3/4 of the original weight, the quantity required was considerable being 35,651 pounds. Richardson then gives particulars of the estimated expense of pemmican manufactured in the Royal Clarence Victualling Yard in Midsummer Quarter 1847. As a byproduct of his work with the first and second Franklin expeditions, Richardson had before this edited and had largely written, though there were several learned collaborators, the magnificent four-volume quarto Fuma Boreal Americana, which had been published with the support of the British government by John Murray. London, 1829 to 1837. In the volume on quadrupeds, which discussing the caribou, he had given his view on pemmican as made by the Red Indians of the subarctic and Arctic forests, that from the quantity of nourishment it contains in small bulk, it is perhaps the best kind of food for those who travel through desert lands. It is of special interest here and fits in with the evidence presented in the chapter Living on the Fat of the Land, that Richardson gives a smaller fat component for the most northerly native pemmican than is given by the usual authorities for pemmican as made in the section between Canis and Montaba. Note, although that whereas the native Arctic pemmican, as described by him, had only a third of fat against two-thirds of lean, Richardson tells us above that when he himself was making pemmican in England, he used nearly as much fat as lean, therefore perhaps 45%. Thus, he was following approximately the high-fat formula of the buffalo pemmican of the fur trade rather than the comparatively low-fat Arctic formula. The 1818 naval expedition of Sir John Ross and the 1819 overland expedition of Sir John Franklin began an epoch of polar exploration in which the British were supreme, as indeed they had been in some previous epochs. It was not yet time for Norway and the United States to begin that contest with Britain for supremacy, which was at its height around 1900. The first use of pemmican on a winter sledge journey in polar exploration seems to have been by Dr. John Rae of the Hudson Bay Company the winter of 1846-47. In northeasterly Canada, west and north of Hudson Bay, in general, pemmican may have been said to have come into winter use with the numerous expeditions that searched for the lost Franklin party through more than a decade following 1846, of which series Dr. Rae's was the first. It is usually considered that the greatest man Britain ever placed in the field of northern exploration was Admiral Sir Francis Leopold McClintock, 1819 through 1907. He distinguished himself more than any of the other numerous commanders during the Franklin search expeditions that ran from the late 40s to the late 50s of the 19th century. It was he who finally discovered enough relics and documents to cause the Franklin search to be considered as having come to an end with his voyage in the Fox from 1848 to 1859. He served in 4 Arctic expeditions, of which he commanded 2. He made the longest Arctic sledge journey to prior to 1900. Indeed, the longest sledge journey ever made by Arctic explorers who depended on pemmican or other provisions which they hauled with them. Longer journeys have since been made by explorers who lived mainly or wholly by hunting. When a new era of Antarctic exploration was more or less deliberately planned by the British at the turn of the century under the formal leadership of the Royal Geographical Society of London, the most distinguished living polar explorers were scourged as collaborators on the Atlantic Manual, a book of 586 pages. London, 1901, McClintock contributed the article on Arctic sledge traveling. On page 297, he says of pemmican that it should consist of nothing but lean and fat, that no salt or preservation of any kind is used, and that it is the most concentrated food known. Like the fur traders of the Pemmican War period around 1810 and 1820, the McClintock believed 50 years later that pemmican would prevent and cure scurvy. In 1877, Sir George Nares was on semi-formal trial in London for having had scurvy on his 1875-76 expedition, at which trial it appeared that they had used lime juice in winter quartz, but not on the sledge journeys. The findings of the tribunal criticized Narks for not having used enough lime juice, which angered McClintock, who wrote denouncing men who paid so much attention to those dietetic theories which happened to be in vogue during a given year and paid so little heed to a testimony from the experience of large numbers of people who had lived for long stretches of time on the foods which the current theory condemned. He gave his own experience as typical. I have myself made several sleddings journeys, varying in length from 20 to 105 days each, without either lime juice or scurvy in any of my parties, and the experience of my brother officers in the Franklin search agreed with my own. Briefly, we lived upon pemmican and enjoyed sound health. With the California gold rush of 1849 began a period when the writings of newcomers to the fur country take the place of journals kept by the old masters, the Ponds. Henry, Thompson, Frobisher, the 49ers had heard much of pemmican before they went into the West. A few were disappointed to find this much praised travel ration below their expectation in palatability. Some are even disgusted with it. However, most of the tenderfeet complain not really against pemmican as such, but rather against methods of preparation which were being used, or which they thought were used. They object to finding in it things like buffalo hair, gravel, human hair. Some writers say that gravel and hair were exceptional. Others seem to believe them common ingredients. Those of long experience agree that there was pemmican and pemmican with a wide variety quality range as in almost any other food. In a study of opinion on pemmican, which I had made for the office of the Quartermaster General of the Army, I copied out from books perhaps 100,000 words of testimony. Instead of trying to summarize this bulky evidence here, I quote at length from two writers, one of them nearly the least and the others nearly the most favorable of those who traveled the plains shortly before the buffalo disappeared. But while pemmican was still in common use, about the most contemporary of those who printed their opinions in this period was a Scottish nobleman, James Cairngorm Earl of Sussex, 1827 to 1905, who made a journey during 1859 to 1860 from the Mississippi River northwest through Canada, almost to the Pacific coast, and back by a different route. The account of this expedition, Saskatchewan and the Rocky Mountains, was published at Edinburgh, 1875. November 20, 1859, the South Sikh party were on the Middle Saskatchewan, had berry pemmican at supper. That is to say, the ordinary buffalo pemmican with Saskatoon berries sprinkled through it at the time of making. Berry pemmican is usually the best of its kind, but poor is the best. Taking scrapings from the driest outside corner of a very stale piece of cold roast beef, added to its lumps of tallowy, rancid fat, then garnish all with long human hairs and short hairs of oxen or dogs or both, and you have a fair imitation of common pemmican, though I should rather suppose it to be less nasty. Pemmican is most endurable when uncooked. My men used to fry it with grease, sometimes stirring in flour and making it flabby mess called rhubarb, which I found almost unbearable. Carefully made pemmican, such as the flavored with the Saskatoon berries, or some that we got from the mission at St. Anne, or the sheep pemmican given to us by the Rocky Mountain hunters, is nearly good, but in two senses, a little of it goes a long way. The book contains many references which show the party, like most travelers of the period, depend on the main on pemmican. But Lord Salskus himself ate little of it. I always took my meals alone, unless now and then when Nkei joined me on special invitation, breakfast, dinner, tea, or supper, whatever the name of the repast, it consisted much of the same materials, tea, flour, cakes, and such meat as happened to be available. At this particular time, my own dish was generally supplied with slices of beef cut from huge joints brought from one or other of the forts. Sometimes I chose dried meat for a variety, but pemmican, the chief food of the rest of the party, I seldom cared to taste. Thus, to a noble Scot, pemmican was nasty, and seemingly he did not know more than taste now, and then the chief food of his travelling companions. 14 years later, Scottish commoner, destined for leadership in Canadian public life, journeyed through the country without having his meals specially prepared and living on the same food as the rest of his party. He is cited here for contrast. George Monroe Grant, D.D. LLD, 1835–1902, was principal of Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario from 1877 to 1902. He was educated at Glasgow University and was ordained a minister of the Church of Scotland. During his career at head of Queen's University, he was looked upon as outstanding both in education and in politics. The most famous of his several books, one that continues to be reprinted, is Ocean to Ocean Toronto, 1873, an account of the preliminary work that led to the extension of the Canadian Pacific Railway from Ontario to the Pacific. The overland expedition described in Ocean to Ocean was commanded by Sir Sandford Fleming, 1827 to 1915, one of the most distinguished of Canada's railway builders, for whom Grant was acting as secretary. The whole journey from Toronto to the Pacific was accomplished between July 16th and October 14th, 1872. They reached what had been the Pemmican country when they arrived at Fort Garry, now Winnipeg, August 1st. But the buffalo were gone from that region, and I find no reference to pemmican as in use by the party until they were well on their way from Winnipeg to Edmonton on August 13th. Dr. Grant's personal experience of pemmican was not so far as his narrative is concerned, more than live weeks, but on the journey he associated with or met a number of Europeans who had used it much longer. To some members of his party and to many at the various stations they passed, it had been the bread of the wilderness from childhood. It is clear as one analyzes the comments that Grant was depending for his views upon a combination of his own experience with what he heard and saw. Most travelers who have described journeys of similar length in the buffalo country have referred to pemmican only a few times in their publications. That Grant refers to it more often than any other writer I have examined is perhaps because most of the others have summarized their impressions when the books were being written, while Grant published what in large part is a reproduction of diary entries set down in the field. Thus, each passage conveys Grant's knowledge and feelings as they were at a specified date. He says on page 24 of the London 1877 edition, our notes are presented to the public and are given almost as they were written so that others might see, as far as possible, a photograph of what we saw and thought from day to day. The first pemmican reference I have discovered is not, however, from Grant's diary, but from his reflections on the development of the province of Manitoba. The fertile plains along the Red River, the Assinobine, and the two Saskatchewans ought to have been opened up by the empire and formed into colonies long ago, but their real value was not known. It was not the business of the Hudson Bay Company to call attention to them as fitted for any other purpose than to feed buffalo, for those plains were their hunting grounds, and their posts on them were kept up chiefly for the purpose of supplying their far northern posts with pemmican, or preserved buffalo meat. The company did what every other corporation would have done, attended simply to its own business. August 9th, 1872. The party was leaving the country of the Assiniboine River for that of the Saskatchewan, and there are references to the first buffalo, the first jerky. The regular use of pemmican did not begin until August 16th, when they reached Fort Carlton on the North Saskatchewan and dined with Mr. Clark on pemmican, a strong but savory dish. Not at all like the dried chips and tallow some Cyberdes have called it. There is pemmican and pemmican, however, and we were warned that what is made for ordinary fare needs all the sauce that hunger supplies to make it palatable. After leaving Fort Carlton on their way up the North Saskatchewan to Edmonton, Grant's entry for August 19th says, Terry gave us pemmican for breakfast, and from this date pemmican was the staple of each meal. Though none of us cared for it raw at first, we all liked it hot. Pemmican and sun-dried thin flitches of buffalo meat are the great food staples of the plains, so much so that when you hear people speak of provisions, you may be sure that they simply mean buffalo meat, either dried or as pemmican. August 22nd. At the camp, the chief treated them with great civility, ordering pemmican as they preferred it to fresh buffalo. August 26th. Camped before sunset within 27 miles of Edmonton, and in honor of the event, brought out our only bottle of claret. As we had no ice, Terry shouted to Susie to bring some cold water, but no Susie appearing, he varied the call to pemmican. This brought Susie, but great was this indignation when a bucket was put into his hands instead of the rich pemmican he was never tired of feasting on. August 31st, they left Edmonton and headed westly for Jasper House. On September 6th, they halted for dinner at the bend of the river, having traveled 9 or 10 miles. Frank, promising us some fish from a touty-looking stream hard by as a change from the everlasting pemmican. Not that anyone was tired of pemmican, all joined in its praises as the right food for a journey, and wondered why the government had never used it in wartime. As an army marches on its stomach, condensed food is an important object for the commissariat to consider, especially when, as in the case of the British Army, long expeditions are frequently necessary. Pemmican is good and palatable, uncooked and cooked. It has numerous other recommendations for campaign diet. It keeps sound for 20 or 30 years, is wholesome and strengthening, portable, and needs no medicine to correct a tri-daily use of it. 2 pounds weight with bread and tea, we found enough for the dinner of 8 hungry men. A bag weighing 100 pounds is only the size of an ordinary pillow, 2 feet long, 1.5 wide, and 6 inches thick. Such a bag then would supply 3 good meals to 130 men. Could the same be said of equal bulk of pork? But as Terry indignantly remarked, the British governor won't dream of pemmican till the Prussians find it out. Frank came back to dinner with one small trout, though Burbray said that he and his mate last summer had caught 100 in 2 hours, some of them 10 pounds in weight. Perforce we dined on pemmican, and liked it better than ever. September 17th, this was an entire reorganization, and again, Terry was the only one of the old set that remained. With us, Buper's only consolation was that he would get pemmican again, for he declared that life without pemmican was nothing but vanity, and we had made the huge mistake of exchanging our pemmican with McCord for pork. The next day and every day after, we rued the bargain, but it was too late. Buper and Velad had suffered grievously in body form from the change, and for an entire day had been almost useless. The doctor was reduced practically to 2 meals a day, for he could not stand fat pork 3 times. Indeed all, with the single exception of Brown, lamented at every meal, as they picked delicately at the coarse pork, the folly of forsaking that which had been so true a standby for 3 weeks. Ocean to Ocean was published in 1873. For any possible change in views during the next several years, I have examined a series of 3 articles: The Dominion of Canada, which Dr. Grant published in Scribner's Magazine during 1880, but have discovered only a single reference, one, however, that fails to indicate any change of attitude. More than the potato to the Irishman or the date palm to the Arab is the buffalo to Indians and half-breeds. By provisions in the Northwest, everybody means pemmican, or buffalo meat preserved in a pounded and triturated state. Grant appears to have considered pemmican only as a travel ration, since he recommends it for British troops in view of an assumption of their special need for mobility. Many soldiers have recommended pemmican for the use of soldiers. There are also cases where soldiers have recommended pemmican for civilian use. For instance, John Wesley Powell, 1834 through 1902, was born in New York State. He graduated from Illinois Wesleyan, was ILDL from Columbia, and Harvard PhD from Heidelberg. He lost his right arm in the Battle of Shiloh and was retired from the United States Army with the rank of major. He was first to descend by boat the Grand Canyon of the Colorado, 1869. He was director of both the United States Geographical Survey and the United States Bureau of Ethnology, and was author of works on the arid regions of the southwestern United States and on the North American Indians. In his 23rd annual administrative report as director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, Major Powell has a general discussion of the Indian, including references to the indebtedness of the white man to him in certain respects. I quote from pages 11 and 13. It is well known that Aboriginal America gave the world corn, the potato, certain beans and squashes, tobacco, 2 varieties of cotton, and the domestic turkey. It is not so well known that the native tribes utilized various other natural resources which might well be introduced into the dietary and commerce of Caucasian peoples, and still less is it realized that various prepared foods habitually used by the Indians are of unsurpassed excellence, for while succotash and hominy have come into general use, the far superior pinoil, tamale, and pemmican are only locally used by whites, and many other desirable dishes are entirely neglected. Powell lived to see the tamale widely popular throughout the United States. In our Southwest, it has attained nearly the position of a national dish. Pinole is less used, but seems to be gaining. In thinking well of pemmican, Major Powell was by no means a pioneer among soldiers of the United States. The early military explorers of the buffalo country seem to have agreed generally with the fur traders. There is, for instance, the report on an exploration of the territory of Minnesota by Brevet Captain John Pope, which was published in Senate Executive Document 42 of the 31st Congress, first session, in connection with an account of the buffalo. The report says that pemmican is of the richest and most nutritious character. It is very palatable, and from its exceeding richness, but little is required to satisfy the appetite. Captain Pope has in mind that the plain pemmican, not the berry sort, for his detailed description of how it is made speaks of only 2 ingredients, lean and fat. On palatability, the captain is evidently giving us his own verdict. As to long-term usefulness, he relies upon observation and no doubt upon common knowledge, where he says, the half-breeds make all their long voyages with their sole article of food, and they march further and with far less baggage and supplies than any people I have ever seen. Grant's book on his transcontinental journey of 1872, from which I have quoted, tells of almost the last summer during which pemmican was of consequence to the fur trade. It had always been a costly food in terms of labor and of the number of buffalo required. The use of an expensive condensed ration paid dividends only while transportation was difficult. The railways were coming in and good highways, with steamboats on the navigable rivers and on the big lakes. Salt meats were cheaper now, in the long run, irrespective of their weight. Pemmican was no longer required as a scurvy preventative, for health could now be maintained through the use of vegetables that were raised in gardens at nearly every post. It was then not so much the disappearance of the buffalo as the coming in of the farmers' beef and potatoes with the associated development of transportation facilities that caused the disappearance of pemmican from the frontier markets even way down north. In the subarctic, the gardens of the missionaries and the post managers worked in with the cattle herds of the ranchmen to produce cheap foods locally. Around the turn of the century, there was a flour mill on the Peace River. Even before that, the successful garden at Fort Good Hope on the Mackenzie, only a few miles south of the Arctic Circle, was shipping potatoes and other produce both up and downstream. But when pemmican disappeared from the fur territories, it appeared in New York and London, on the shelves of outfitters that catered to wealthy sportsmen journeys to the North Woods, for mountain climbing, for fishing excursions, and for weekends. Ballooning was one of the great sports before the coming of the airplane. The balloonists in Europe do not seem to have used pemmican. Unlike the European polar explorers, they somehow were not in the tradition, but the Americans knew and used pemmican. Many of that generation are gone. One of the most distinguished of those who remain is Augustus Post, who has kindly replied, March 9, 1944, to a letter asking about his use of pemmican. David Abercrombie Authority on Camping and formerly a member of Abercrombie and Fitch, Sporting and Expedition Outfitters, and member of the Campfire Club of America, suggests and provided pemmican for our balloon trips, also for automobile trips to the woods of New Brunswick. Hunting big game on my balloon trip in 1907, the International Balloon Race from St. Louis with Dr. Alan R. Hawley, president of the Aero Club of America. We used pemmican sewed up in rawhide bags holding 5 pounds, which was the way it was put up in Canada. We used it again in our balloon trip from St. Louis in 1910, when we won the International Gordon Bennett Balloon Race Cup. We found it invaluable as a food and superior to canned or iron rations, as they were called, as issued to the Army. The package was easily handled and the rawhide could be used after the bag was empty, much better than a can. We made straps and thongs of the rawhide and could pack instruments and delicate things to be carried after landing through the forest. I liked it and relished it. Stewed, I believe it was only an improvement on jerked or dried meat extensively used by the Indians and early trappers and hunters. Dan Beard had pemmican for his boys, camp at Holly, Pennsylvania, and the boys carried it on hikes when they stayed away from camp. It keeps well and does not spoil. I do not know about its present use in aviation, but would think that its exceptional properties would make it of the first importance for an emergency food as well as a regular article of diet where ease of preparation and maximum nutrition were desired. It can be eaten without cooking or stewed in boiling water, in which case other things can be added like dehydrated vegetables, etc. By the middle of the 19th century, the tropics and temperate zones were pretty well mapped, and the real explorations were mainly in the polar regions, Arctic and Antarctic. At the time, the United States began to compete seriously in the field of exploration. Chief use of pemmican from then on was, therefore, among the polar explorers. Rear Admiral Robert Edwin Peary, 1856 to 1920, is usually considered the greatest of modern Arctic explorers, or as sharing that distinction with Fridtjof Nansen in sledging He far outranked Nansen, and he is no doubt the greatest sledge traveler in the entire history of polar exploration. A graduate of Bowdoin, Peary began his fieldwork in the tropics. He was assistant engineer of the Nicaraguan Ship Canal Survey, 1884 to 85, and was in charge of the Nicaraguan Canal Surveys, 1887 to 1888. Peary's first Arctic journey was a reconnaissance of the Greenland inland ice in the summer of 1886. He wintered first during 1891 to 92 and spent in the Arctic altogether 9 winters. One on some of the longest sledge journeys in history, depending mainly on pemmican as food for men and dogs, he determined the insularity of Greenland, discovered Peary Land, explored Ellesmere Island, and made several journeys out on the drifting ice of the Polar Sea, culminating in his attainment of the North Pole on April 6, 1909. This was accomplished by a round-trip sledge journey from land to the North Pole and back to land again, where about 900 miles were covered in 63 days. The men not only walking, but at times pulling with the dogs or otherwise working to support the sledges or push them ahead. That journey is the longest on record where dependence was on pemmican. Peary retired from active fieldwork in 1909. There were then available only two techniques that made long polar journeys feasible: one to live by hunting, the other to carry the things needed. Peary was the unquestioned master of the second technique. It seemed to his explorer friends, as it did to his publishers, that he ought to write a book explaining his methods so that they would not be lost to future generations. The result was Secrets of Polar Travel, New York, 1917. I quote from pages 78 to 79. Too much cannot be said of the importance of pemmican to a polar expedition. It is an absolute sine qua non. Without it, a sledge party cannot compact its supplies within a limit of weight to make a serious polar journey successful. With pemmican, the most serious sledge journey can be undertaken and carried to a successful issue in the absence of all other foods. Of all other foods that I am acquainted with, pemmican is the only one that under appropriate conditions a man can eat twice a clay for 365 days in a year and have the last mouthful taste as good as the first. And it is the most satisfying food I know. I recall innumerable marches in bitter temperatures when men and dog had been worked to the limit, and I reached the place for camp feeling as if I could eat my weight of anything. When the pemmican ration was dealt out and I saw my little half-pound lump, about as large as the bottom third of an ordinary drinking glass, I have often felt a sullen rage that life should contain such situations. By the time I had finished the last morsel, I would not have walked round the completed igloo for anything or everything that the St. Regis, the Blackstone, or the Palace Hotel could have put before me. During the 23 years from 1886 to 1909, Peary had been almost continuously either traveling within the Arctic or preparing at home for new Arctic journeys. So what he tells us in 1917 of pemmican is the opinion of a man who has used the food through so many years that one may think he has forgotten what he thought of it during the first and second years. Accordingly, I quote a British traveler who was a member of only 2 expeditions, a total of 3 Antarctic seasons, during which time the sledging on which pemmican was used probably did not cover much more than a total of 6 months. For in camp they would naturally use little pemmican, since these expeditions, like practically all others, were short on condensed foods, and used them, therefore, only where other foods would not serve because of their too great bulk and weight. Raymond E. Priestley was a member of the scientific staffs of the first Shackleton expedition, 1907-09, and the second Scott expedition, 1910 to 1913. He served with distinction through the First World War, and among his books in a history of the British Signal Service in France. He had been Secretary General of the Faculties of the University of Cambridge, England, Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University, Australia, and as been since 1938 principal and vice chancellor of the University of Birmingham, England. In his book, An Arctic Adventure, New York, 1915, he refers to pemmican frequently in terms of its being a standard food. I quote only what he says on page 344. Our pemmican consisted of 60% of fat and 40% of shredded meat and was an ideal food for sledging. Under ordinary circumstances, when one first starts on a journey, one's full allowance is seldom eaten, but as time passes and the work and the keen air take effect, one becomes hungrier and hungrier until the sledging allowance of pemmican is not sufficient to satisfy the cravings aroused. It is then that pemmican is truly appreciated at its full worth. Nothing else is comparable with it. I have taken all sorts of delicacies on short trips when the food allowance is elastic. I've picked up similar delicacies at depots along the line of march, and I have even taken a small plum pudding or a piece of wedding cake for a Christmas treat. But on every such occasion, I would willingly have given either of these luxuries for half its weight of the regulation pemmican. It can therefore be imagined how we looked forward to a resumption of pemmican after a 6 months enforced abstinence. If Priestley, who had lived on a ration that was mainly pemmican for probably less than a year altogether, was eager to resume it after a 6 months enforced abstinence, it might be surprised that those who had lived on pemmican for years would long for it correspondingly. That is indeed the case when one talks to the addicts, but not many of them have placed this in print, except as in saying that they were glad to be on the road again, for they would once more be eating pemmican. But there are some striking cases on record, among them that of the Beaver Club. The Yankees, Scots, and others who were the pioneers of the Northwest Company in many cases retired to Montreal when they became wealthy and lived there in grand style. A part of the style was the fabulous club where they feasted on pemmican that had been brought expensively by canoe and man packing a distance of 2,000 miles. Douglas Mackay says in his book, The Honorable Company, A History of Hudson's Bay Company, New York, 1936. In Montreal, the full-blooded lives of these men found outlet in the Beaver Club, where hospitality was famous. The club was founded in 1785 with 19 members, who qualified by having wintered in the Northwest. The Payne Hall, later the membership number 55 men. The club met fortnightly in winter. Fines such as 6 bottles of Madeira were imposed for neglect of exacting rules and ritual. Members were large gold medals on club nights. Pemmican was bought from the Saskatchewan to be served in the unfamiliar atmosphere of mahogany, silver, and candle glow. Thank you for joining me on this less than perfect reading of Chapter 11 of Fat of the Land. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you continue the series and enjoy the rest of the series. Thank you. Bye.